Well, good afternoon and welcome to the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Carol Summerfield. I'm the executive director here. And I want to welcome you and thank you all for being here. For those of you who've been here before, thank you for being regular supporters. We really appreciate it. I wanted to invite you to celebrate the local legends with us. And this is our annual fundraiser and one of our best attended events, as this evening can demonstrate for you. This has been sold out for several weeks now. Clearly, we need a bigger museum. All right, I want to thank our sponsors. So Tish and Tom Hunter, Ann Hunting and Ari Mintz, and Robin and Sandy Stewart are our lead sponsors for this year's event. And our primary sponsors are Karen Gray Crable and John Crable and David and Pamela Watt. So thank you all very much for your support. Yes. And thank you to the numerous patron sponsors and supporters who help pull this together this year and every year. I also would like to acknowledge our appreciation for the previous local legends in the audience, Jack Schuler and Gene Hotchkiss. I will not make you stand. And a special thanks to our local legends event co-chairs, Fred Jackson and Kristen Chun, who you will meet at the end of this program, and to our board of directors, many of whom are here supporting this, our staff and our volunteers for all the hard work that went into making this year's event such a success. I am going to pass the mic to Don, who has a few words before the interview starts with David Sweet. And with no further ado.
Carol, thank you, Carol. Are there any Ditka books available? They're all about 40 years old now. Well, thank you for that introduction, Carol. I've got to say, those quotes up there, I don't know if you saw them, from Ditka and Butkus, they weren't that nice to me when I was covering them. That was a real surprise. Just so you people know, I went to Florida once and got to talk to Red Grange, interview Red Grange. And I went to Texas once and I played in a golf tournament, Sammy Ball's golf tournament, and got to interview the first great passer in the pros. And one time I went to a game in Los Angeles at the Coliseum, and I rode up in an elevator to the press box with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. It was just the three of us. I have no idea what those two were doing in there. So I just want to explain to you that it's true that I've been around legends. I've talked to them, I've interviewed them, but I didn't think that qualified me. John and Yoko did not ask for my autograph in that elevator, even though they had ample time to do so. I do want to thank the History Center for this honor, and I want to thank you all for coming out and supporting the History Center. I think you deserve an award for not only sponsoring and helping to such a valuable community asset, but you've agreed to listen to somebody talk about a football team that's won 2 games in over a year. I brought my notebook along because I think you're going to ask about history that I've either forgotten or I'm trying to forget. And you can understand why I'm a little daunted here. If you just look at the list of recipients, starting with astronaut Jim Lovell, speaking of being around legends, and I'm glad that Gene and Jack are here as well. I and several others here have been privileged to be in a book club with Jim Lovell, and we, of course, wanted to read Apollo 13, the book that he co-wrote. If you haven't read the book, you've probably seen the movie. But we used to meet at people's houses, and he was hosting this particular night, and on the lake, his home on the lake, and I was driving down Deer Path, and it happened to be this brilliant full moon coming up over the lake. Just a spectacular sight. The reflection was just shimmering off the water. And we get to Jim's house, there were about 10 of us, and most of us had noticed the same thing. And we're sitting around marveling at this magnificent sight, and it occurred to us that one of us had actually been there. Now I know he didn't land. I know he didn't land, but close enough you get the idea. But I do mention this by way of acknowledging that I mention it by way of acknowledging that some people are more legendary than others. And I do take comfort in being reminded that 13 years ago when Jim was introduced at this event, even Jim Lovell offered his apology in case people were expecting Tom Hanks. Right? Isn't that right, John? I want to thank all my friends and relatives for coming out tonight. My whole family is here, including Kathy and our 4 grandchildren. All 4 are in college, and they chose to be here rather than spend Halloween weekend on campus. I have friends from my college days that came all the way from Ohio just to hear stories they've heard for 40 or 50 years. Thank you, Art and Mary Kay. And I want to point out that I am not the only sports writer who has been honored by the Pro Football Hall of Fame. My friend Ira Miller wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle, covered the 49ers, and he received the same honor from the Hall of Fame that I received. I also want to introduce some colleagues that started with me at the Tribune in the 1960s. Pierce White surprised me. He was an editor and from Lake Forest College. And we have Neil Milbert and Mike Conklin here, who between them I think covered every sport known to man. So you probably are familiar with their bylines. And 2 surprise guests tonight for me. In the early 1960s, probably 1961, a couple of twins from Cicero were in 8th grade and wrote a letter to George Hallis asking if they could be clubhouse boys at Wrigley Field for the Bear games. And he said, if you keep your grade, he wrote back and said, if you keep your grades up, I think I could find a place for them. Sure enough, Carl and Tony Ruzicka became clubhouse boys in 1963 for the championship, and starting with the lasted through the Sayers, or part of the Sayers, and they're here tonight.
Wow.
And finally, I want to thank David Sweet for the part that he's playing in this. He is a local journalist who's written books on Lamar Hunt and on the 1972 Olympic basketball team. He's a champion of local journalism. He ran the Lake Forester for years and now writes the Lake Forest Love blog. I hope you are all familiar with the plight of local journalism and are supporting it in any way that you know. And that's my public service announcement for tonight. And I'll turn it over to David.
Well,
Thank
Don,
you.
Don, that was all fascinating. I don't think you've left me with any questions to ask. But it's great to see such a fantastic crowd out here, and I'm honored to be able to interview Don today. And some of you know, some of you don't, Don went to The Ohio State University. And
OH!
And not only that, he took a course on football from the legendary coach Woody Hayes. I think a lot of you remember Woody Hayes. And so, Don, I wanted to ask, was Woody as intimidating in the classroom as he was on the sidelines? And what was your final grade?
Well, in case any of you don't know, Woody was a crazy football coach at Ohio. I'll call him an eccentric football coach at Ohio State in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He got fired in 1978 for punching out a kid on the sidelines after the poor kid had the temerity to make an interception. I think that's the definition of eccentric. And I took some physical education courses at Ohio State because I wasn't completely sure whether I wanted to be a writer or a coach. And Woody, of course, taught a football class, and he was he was an excellent instructor, really, a captivating speaker and storyteller, and he required a notebook. And I kept meticulous notes, kept all of his stories. It was very good practice for me as a writer, as a journalist. I got an A- because I forgot that I didn't know that you were supposed to have an index. Anyway, Woody gave great advice to that class, and most of them, almost all of them, knew they were going to be coaches. But Woody said, if any of you in here can possibly imagine doing anything else in life besides coaching, then don't coach. He understood the toll. He understood the pressure that it takes to coach. So, of course, that confirmed my vocation as a writer. Not that writers don't work hard, we just don't get fired as often. And then when I got to the Tribune, the boss said, well, you went to Ohio State, you must know something about football. Would you like to cover the Bears? And after dealing with Woody, I was never intimidated by George Halas or Mike Ditka or really anybody. So it was an excellent education.
And you just mentioned George Halas, the founder of the NFL, and I believe he's the one who got Red Grange onto the team, the Galloping Ghost. So tell me a little bit about what he was like, and did he ever react angrily to any of the stories you wrote for the Tribune?
Well, according to George Langford there, my boss, he called up every Monday morning complaining, but I don't think that was true at all. George Halas, as you know, didn't invent pro football, but he had a hand in just about everything it's become, including naming the National Football League. He was a Cubs fan, and he said if the Cubs played in the American League, it would have probably been the American Football League. I think of him, I always remember him more as an entrepreneur than an inventor. And I'll give you some examples. In 1925, you mentioned that he signed Red Grange out of the University of Illinois, and Red Grange was the most popular football player in America at the time because the pro game had not caught on with the public. And so he took Grange and about 16 other players on a coast-to-coast barnstorming tour. They played 17 games in 61 days. They got 65,000 people at the Polo Grounds in New York. They got 75,000 people at the Coliseum in Los Angeles, and it really helped popularize pro football. But it was not his idea. The whole tour was not his idea of his agent, a guy by the name of C.C. Pyle, who was a movie theater operator in Champaign. I'll give you another example. It was the same thing with X's and O's. The Bears are credited with popularizing the T formation, which is still the basic formation today. But it wasn't Halas's idea. He had been the player coach from 1920, the inception of the team, until he retired as a player in 1930 and took a break as a coach. And he hired, as a head coach of the Bears, a guy by the name of Ralph Jones from Lake Forest Academy, believe it or not. And Ralph Jones is known as the father of the T formation. In 1947, Hallis signed a television contract for a regional outlet to televise all of the Bears' home games. They got paid $900 a game. And Hallis said, I couldn't believe that they would pay us. But he was urged to pursue television by Don Maxwell, who was a friend of his and a editor at the Tribune. So Hallis was shrewd enough to take advantage of opportunities. He had two vocabularies, one for polite company and one that was just comically profane. He could make a football player, blush. You know that saying that he swears like a sailor? It might have originated with Hallis because he joined the Navy shortly after World War I and rejoined them during World War II when he took another break from coaching. He coached until 1967 when he was 72 and said a bad hip no longer allowed him to chase referees up and down the sidelines. He had a son, George Hallis Jr., who had become president by this time, but he died prematurely at age 54 of a heart attack in 1979. And when that happened, Hallis reassumed control of the team. And Hallis, by this time, was 84. And one of his players, Stan Jones, Art remembers Stan Jones from the Hall of Fame, a Hall of Fame lineman. He said it was like Orville Wright coming back to run United Airlines. But in 1982, when Hallis was 86, he's the one that hired Mike Ditka. He's the one that brought back Buddy Ryan as defensive coordinator, and it set the stage for the teams of the 80s. And I remember that press conference. Bill Gleason of the Sun-Times, some of you remember Bill Gleason of the Sun-Times, said, George, are you senile? And I can remember Hallis's reaction. He says, there's no gosh darn senility in this carcass. He did not say gosh darn. And less than 2 years later, he died. In fact, it was 40 years ago this coming Tuesday. It was a remarkable life. And yes, he did, at least on one occasion, complain about something I'd written. I can't remember the details. It was in the early 70s, and the Bears were either on strike or were going on strike. And he thought the story I wrote made the organization look bad. Now, I didn't tell him that the organization was doing a pretty good job of that without any help from the media. But I did convince him that it really wasn't as bad as he thought it was. I was really lucky to have known him, and he really liked the Tribune. So I was lucky I worked for the Tribune.
Well, great. And speaking of George Hallis, his daughter Virginia McCaskey owns the Bears now, and she just turned 100 years old this year. Yeah. And what are some of your favorite stories about Virginia?
Well, you really do need some perspective when you're talking about a 100-year-old woman. I mean it seriously. She'll turn 101 in February. Her dad, think about this, her dad was born in the 19th century. We just talked about the Red Grange tour. She was on it. She was only 2 or 3 years old, but Red Grange carried her through the train stations so that he wouldn't get bothered by autograph seekers. When she was born in 1923, Hallis said, I was stunned. A girl. He says, we couldn't believe it. He said, we assumed, mind you, our firstborn would be George Stanley Hallis Jr. That's the way things were back then. And when George Stanley Hallis Jr. did come along 2 years later, then there was never any expectation for Virginia to have anything to do with the family business. And when her brother died at 54, then Hallis retook control, but then when he died in 1983, Virginia was left with this inheritance, thrust into this inheritance without any preparation, without any experience whatsoever. And she's made it her life mission to sustain that legacy. She's called it a wonderful burden. People talk about selling bears. The bears ought to be sold, or why aren't the bears sold? Anybody that thinks that has not talked to Virginia. In fact, when we wrote the book, we asked her about this, and she said, "What would we have if we didn't retain ownership of the bears? We would have money. What do you do with money? How important is that? It just doesn't measure up as far as I'm concerned." Now, she had 11 kids, 9 of them are still alive, and a lot of grandkids, and they could probably figure out something to do with money. What she likes, she's very unpretentious. She lives in a modest ranch house in the suburbs. She raised her kids in a modest home in another suburb. Her kids remember her on a ladder cleaning out gutters and painting the house. She goes to Mass every day until recently, and not that long ago, she drove to Mass. Her neighbors thought she was a nun. She worked, really. I remember a story. She was taking a water aerobics class at the YWCA, and the women in the class were all Bear fans and all excited about the Bear season and talking about the Bears, and had no idea who she was.
Wow.
No idea. I remember she and her husband Ed marveling to me about discovering a new restaurant they just found on a recent road trip, Cracker Barrel. Oh, it's true. It's a true story. She's very happy. She's very satisfied to have the title of secretary of the board of directors of the Bears, even though she's the owner. She's happy to be the secretary. She did inherit her father's very tough and stubborn gene. Nothing happens on that team without her knowledge and approval. In 1999, she fired her own son, Michael, who was president of the team after the hiring of Dave Wanstedt's successor as coach got botched. I know that she herself has been considered for induction into the Hall of Fame, but she's really just as happy that the building in Canton is the address on George Hallis Drive. Yeah.
And you've known a lot of famous players, and you've often said, you get asked the question, what is so-and-so really like? Yeah. And how do you respond?
Well, it's interesting when you ask me about George and Virginia and what they're really like, and that is a question we get asked. I know Ira's been asked, what's that guy really like? I asked Dick Duran, the coach of the Bears. He was the most well-read coach of the Bears that I covered. I asked him once if he had read a recent biography on Joe DiMaggio. And he said, oh, no. He said, I would never read a story on DiMaggio. He was my hero. I don't want to know that much about him. Well, most people are more curious. We live in a celebrity society. Although I usually think especially in the case of athletes, what they do on the field or on the court is just so much more interesting than what they say or even what they're really like. And I'd also add that the majority of coaches and players that I've dealt with, at least seemed like they're pretty good people. But my point is that you never know. In the 1970s, there was a superstar. It was a terrific with the media. He was outgoing, affable, quotable. The Bears were going to play his team. His team was playing on a Monday night previously, so I made arrangements to go to the Monday night game and talk to him. This is 40 or 50 years ago. We don't have that kind of access anymore. But I made arrangements to talk to him at his hotel before the game. He said, sure, come up to the room. So I go up to the room. I spend 45 minutes with him. He's very quotable, relaxed, accommodating. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? O.J. Simpson. I rest my case, so to speak. Yeah. All right.
Great story. You've known a lot of great football players. You've seen a lot of great football over the years, but I believe you have two favorites you think are the best you've seen, Walter Payton and Dick Butkus. And unfortunately, Dick Butkus passed away earlier this month, and I know you were good friends with him, and I know that had to hit hard when that happened. But tell me, what made Payton and Butkus stand apart from all the other players?
Well, they were really and that was tough. That October 5th, I don't know how many were here, but all of a sudden I find out that Dick Butkus had died. I just texted him at the during the season opener and the day afterwards. So that really hit hard. Of all the people, I mean, Virginia's 100 years old. Mike Ditka isn't doing that well, and Butkus is the one that dies. But anyway, Butkus and Payton to me were the most passionate, relentless, best all-around football players I ever saw. Now, they both happened to play for the Bears, and I knew both of them, and I covered both of them, but my opinion is completely objective. They were very similar in that they pretty much could do everything. Payton, of course, set NFL rushing records, but I remember for his blocking. He could pass, he could punt, he could catch. He led the team in tackles after interceptions, which is a very valuable skill when you play for the Bears. They both played with great exuberance and joy. I remember Gary Fensick saying that Payton always reminded him of a kid trying to make the 8th grade team every day. Butkus, 50 years after he was done playing, is still the model middle linebacker to this day. He told me he thought he'd play linebacker for 10 years, and then he'd switch over and play center for 10 years. Because he played both at the University of Illinois, if you remember. I would have loved to have seen him on the goal line like they used a Refrigerator Perry 12 years later, because he played running back at vocational high school in Chicago. He played catcher in Little League Baseball. He said he wanted to be a catcher because he liked the collisions at home plate. In fact, he would run halfway up the third baseline and knock guys down before they got to home plate. And he said their mothers would boo him. They were both practical jokers. Payton used to bring those M80 cherry bombs out to practice, and he would attach them. He would attach them to a lit cigarette and just scare the heck out of everybody within riding it. Both of them played on pretty bad teams for most of the time, but neither one of them whined publicly, at least around me. Butkus told me he was pretty naive. Actually, he sincerely said, "I always thought we were going to win." He played on the first year I covered the team was in 1969 when they were 1-13, the worst record they've ever had. And Butkus still was elected the NFL Defensive Player of the Year. And despite what I just said about knowing what these guys are really like, I think both of them for superstars were very normal guys. The Walter Payton Man of the Year Award is a very coveted award given for community service, even though Payton was the first guy to say, "I'm not perfect." And the Butkus Award is given every year to the best high school linebacker, the best college linebacker, the best pro linebacker. And he also was at the forefront of anti-drug use. He had an I Play Clean campaign, really was against young players, especially using steroids. And I think that a lot of his persona was manufactured by teammates and opponents, and Butkus himself. You got to remember that long after he was a football player, he was an actor. And I remember just a couple of years ago, I played in his golf tournament down on the south side, and I was impressed afterwards. He didn't sit at the table with with the celebrities. He sat at a table with his high school buddies. I thought that was, I always remember that.
And you mentioned Fridge Perry, and a lot of us in the room know Fridge Perry was part of the Bears' only Super Bowl championship, the '85 Bears team with the punky QB, Super Bowl shuffle, Mike Singletary at middle linebacker. It was just an awesome team, and especially an awesome defense. You covered that team. What was that like?
Well, I don't know if any of the rest of you noticed, but the first Monday night game this year, I've got to take some water here. I'd rather have a beer. First Monday night game this year, I'm listening. I probably was listening to the Manning brothers, who were great. And within the first few minutes, there was a reference to the 1985 Bears this year. But before I reminisce about that year, I want to remind you and remind myself the contrast of how bad things were. We talked about that 1969 team when they were 1-13, their worst record. It was not their worst team, I'm telling you. They had Butkus and Sayers on that team, and I've seen worse teams. People ask me what it was like then when I started covering good teams in the 80s, and I always tell them, well, the difference for me is I just had to learn all new adjectives. That 1985 team, that 1985 team was a reporter's dream. It really was. I argue it was the most memorable team in NFL history. Now, I didn't say the best. The only undefeated team in the NFL history is the 1987 Dolphins. 72 Dolphins, I'm sorry. The 72 Dolphins. But if you remember, they were the no-name defense. And as David mentioned, that was not the problem with the Bears. People knew them by their nicknames. Sweetness and the Fridge and the Punky QB. And remember McMahon called Ditka Sybil because of his multiple personalities. And Fridge Perry called Ditka Doctor, and we didn't know why. Well, of course, Mr. MD. We didn't realize. And Ditka had a nickname for the whole team, the Grabowskis. They weren't a dynasty, but for that 1 year, I don't think there's been anything like it in the NFL before or since. There were just so many extraordinary moments. The first one that comes to mind for me, of course, is the Thursday night up in Minnesota when they were getting beat, and McMahon is hurt. He hadn't practiced, so he's on the sidelines, and they're getting beaten. He's begging Ditka to put him back in the game, put him in the game. He hadn't been in the game at all. Put him in the game. Finally, in the third quarter, they're behind, and Ditka relents. He puts him in there. First pass he throws is a touchdown. Second pass he throws is a touchdown. His seventh pass he throws is a touchdown. I mean, it's just remarkable. And, of course, they win the game. And then they play a Monday night in Green Bay, or not in Green Bay, it was in Soldier Field. And Ditka puts a 300-pound rookie defensive tackle, Fridge Perry, at running back, and he scores a touchdown, and he blocks, makes a great block, and he becomes nationally famous. 2 weeks later, they go to Green Bay, and the Bears find a huge bag of manure in their locker room. Then they go to Dallas, and they play the Cowboys. The Cowboys are known as America's team, and the Bears win 44-0. And Dan Hampton, the defensive tackle, says, well, we must be the Kremlin's team. Said they only lost that one game, a Monday night in Miami. And the very next day, after a Monday night game, they taped the Super Bowl shuffle. The very next day. You know, that primitive rap video that it had the audacity to celebrate a Super Bowl before the regular season was even over. Now all of the players didn't think this was a good idea, mind you. But as you know, that Super Bowl shuffle has had a life of its own ever since. In fact, if you look up a Wikipedia biography on Otis Wilson, who was one of the great linebackers the Bears have ever had, His biography says lead soloist in the shuffling crew. It does. They get to the Super Bowl and they get off the plane in controversy because Michael McCaskey wouldn't allow an acupuncturist on the plane who was treating Jim McMahon's sore rear end. They wouldn't allow him on the plane. So the Bears are all mad at Mike McCaskey. So they go to practice, and McMahon moons a helicopter, a television helicopter. He says, I just wanted to show them where it hurt. Then he gets accused for calling the women in New Orleans unflattering names. You know, he'd been in trouble the entire playoffs for wearing that headband that had different messages on it, including one that had Rozelle for the commissioner, Pete Rozelle. And he got fined, but Pete Rozelle wrote him a note, wrote him a memo. He said, you guys have captured the imagination of the country. And that's really the gist of all this. The National Football League had started to become the no-fun league. And ESPN in 2015 did a documentary on the Bears, 30 for 30, on that 85 team. And Dan Hampton asked the producer, said, well, now, what's the premise of this? And the guy said, well, we just want to document the rise and fall of the greatest team in sports history. And Hampton said, whoa, you mean football history? And the guy said, no. He said, you guys changed everything, the whole concept of marketing, promotion, videos. You see, ESPN didn't exist until 1978. And the Bears were sort of on the cusp of this new era of 24/7 sports coverage and all of its nonsense. And 40 years later, you were still talking about the 85 Bears.
Well, thanks for taking us back to that glorious year. And you mentioned that, and you were obviously correct, they did not become a dynasty, yet they had so many Hall of Famers from Walter Payton, Mike Singletary, a number of others. What happened to the team that you would think would have at least gone back to the Super Bowl and maybe won 2 or 3 others?
Well, you know, it is the players' biggest regret, even to this day. And all I can say is that nothing's ever the same from year to year, as we all know. Buddy Ryne, the defensive coordinator, left to become the coach at Philadelphia. They still had a great defense statistically, but Ditka said, we never created the same fear again. There are all kinds of reasons. One that nobody thinks of, maybe Ira does. The 49ers might have been better. I always go to the most obvious reason, and that's instability at quarterback. In the 3 years following 1985, the 86, 87, 88 seasons, Jim McMahon started 1 game total in December. Those 3 seasons total, 1 game in December. Now he came back for 2 games in the postseason, came off an injury. But that quarterback instability compounded with what I think is Ditka, I hope he's not listening, was the worst. He was a terrible, terrible manager and coach of quarterbacks. He deserves credit. He deserves credit for that 1985 championship, but he was just a horrible manager of quarterbacks. He had a terrible relationship. I'll give you a scene to explain it. He wanted to go over a game plan once with McMahon in the locker room before the game, and he's got his suit and tie on. He's got his clipboard, his charts, his colored pencils. He goes in. McMahon is lying in front of his locker undressed, except for little Donald Duck sunglasses. And instead of paying any attention at all to Ditka, he's looking at Hustler magazine. Now that's their relationship. That's their relationship. They had a problem with quarterbacks throughout the 80s. Mike Singletary said Ditka just killed quarterbacks, got in their hearts, he said, got in their hearts. He said he would have killed Montana and Marino. In 1984, I'll tell you another story. In 1984, McMahon missed 7 games because of an injury. And a guy named Rusty Lish was playing quarterback in San Diego on a Monday night. And he comes off the field, and Ditka's just cussing him up one side and down the other. So it's time for Lish to go back on the field. There's no Lish. The offensive coordinator comes by and he says he's not going back in the game. He says you can't talk to him that way. Ditka says, oh my gosh. He goes over to Lish and he's begging him to go back in the game. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Lish goes back in the game. They lose the game. On the plane ride home, Lish is sitting in the back of the plane reading a Bible. Ditka walks down the aisle. He says, Rusty, I hope there's something in that book about job opportunities because you're going to need one. McMahon never played 16 games, never played a full season, even in 85. In 86, he had a shoulder injury, and Ditka had lost confidence in the backup, Steve Fuller and Mike Tomczak, so he has the bright idea to sign Doug Flutie. From the United States Football League, he'd been playing for the New Jersey Generals, who happened to be owned by a guy named Donald Trump before they went out of business. Because of mismanagement. What a surprise. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. Anyway, Flutie was only 5'9", and Ditka said, I don't care if he's 4'1", he's a winner. Well, he started a playoff game. Of course, the Bears lose. Now, Flutie was never embraced by his teammates. They called him Bambi. And you know those bags of balls that they'd bring out before games to warm up? Somebody had stuffed the bag full of those little miniature rubber footballs for Flutie. Now we go to 1987. In 1987, the Bears go on strike, because you remember the league goes on strike. And the league has the bright idea that they're going to have a replacement teams. And the replacement teams are made up of cast-offs, policemen, construction workers. And they play 3 games before the strike ends. And Ditka then calls these replacement teams the real Bears. Well, you can imagine how that went over in the locker room. And they lose another playoff game. McMahon comes off injured, they lose another playoff game. Now, by 1988, things had really started to fall apart. Wilbur Marshall and Willie Gault, 2 great players, had left. Walter Payton had retired. Gary Fensick had retired. And Ditka, if you recall, has a heart attack. It's the 1988 season. And his cardiologist says, no more drinking and smoking. And Steve McMichael, the great defensive tackle, says, that was our cue, baby. McMichael and Hampton go into Ditka's office, and they take all of his expensive Cuban cigars, all of his sipping whiskey, all of his brandy, and they redistribute all of it to his teammates. Now, Ditka comes back rather quickly, in fact, and he goes into his office, and there's McMichael and Hampton sitting there smoking cigars, and Ditka says, what are you guys doing? And McMichael says, we're just trying to save your life, Coach. Well, they still went 12-4 that year, believe it or not, and they play the championship game against Irish 49ers in Soldier Field. It's freezing cold. McMahon comes back. It's bare weather. Joe Montana throws 3 touchdown passes. They lose again. Well, now I'm going too far, but now it's 1989. McMahon was gone, and everything changes. Even the nicknames had changed by now. The fridge was now known as Biscuit, as in one biscuit shy of 400 pounds. So the question is really not why were they not a dynasty. The question seems to be how did they ever win in the first place? And there is one other reason. There is one other reason they weren't a dynasty. If you remember, after 1985, their cheerleading squad got disbanded, the Honey Bears. And the Honey Bears claim they put a jinx on the Bears, just similar to the Cubs jinx, the Billy Goat jinx that the Cubs had.
Wow, great,
fantastic
story. And you've sort of referenced some of them as we've spoken. Over the years, the Bears have, you've covered a lot of decisions they've made. You've seen a lot of decisions they've made, coaching decisions on what plays to call, players to draft, moving from Wrigley Field to Soldier Field, many, many decisions. What would you say is the best decision you've seen the Bears ever make and the worst decision?
Well, let's see. I'm going to divide that one into two parts. One would be on the field, a draft decision, and one would be off the field, say an organizational decision. Let's go the bad first. I think the worst thing has to be Halas's failure to address a succession plan. You know, after his son died and he reassumed control without grooming anybody. And Virginia says, will admit, for the record, you know, more than most people, my dad thought he was immortal. And of course, nobody is except maybe Virginia. I don't know. But I think that really, that failure has led to a lot of the problems of the last 40 years. So what, and then the best thing they ever did on,
or maybe there hasn't been one.
No, the worst. Where are we? We are at the. Well, on the field, our worst is we're on the worst, right? On the field, we could take a
Plenty
vote.
Of those.
We could take a vote about that. It has to be a quarterback, right? And it has to be something about quarterbacks. I know in 1949, Halas said Bobby Lane, when he got rid of Bobby Lane, he sold Bobby Lane, who became a Hall of Fame quarterback. He said that was my biggest blunder. But I think they've had a lot of company since. The worst quarterback they ever drafted with the number one draft choice was Cade McNown in 1999. He was calling plays that didn't exist. but worse than that has to be in 2017 when they took Mitch Trubisky because they passed up Patrick Mahomes, who's the best player in football today. So that has to be the worst. Then the best.
If there is one.
They're the best. Well, on the field would have to be the '65 draft when they got Sayers and Butkus and Sayers with the third and fourth picks in the draft. That'll never be bettered, I don't think. And the best decision has to be when Halas Jr. hired Jim Finks as general manager in 1974, and Finks is the one that drafted the core of that great team of the 80s. Now, it could be that George McCaskey's recent decision to hire Kevin Warren as the president could even be better than that because of Kevin Warren's background with the Big Ten and with building the stadium, the Viking Stadium. But you can't say that yet. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you mentioned a couple of horrible Bears draft picks at quarterback, and they really have never replaced Sid Luckman's greatness, and that goes back to the 40s, so it's 70-plus years. So looking at today's team, is Justin Fields the answer, or is this Division II undrafted rookie Tyson Bagent? Could he be a great quarterback?
Well, let me... I knew this question about quarterbacks was going. I'm ready for this one. I had to do a lot of research on this. I hope I don't get in the weeds. But I spent about 40 years trying to figure out this quarterback thing. You know, since Sid Luckman, I've got some facts here. Since Sid Luckman left 73 years ago, the Bears have had 64 starting quarterbacks. Wow. Now, I've got one word for that. My word is hilarious. You know, and in fact, in 1953 now, Halas said my worst problem was a quarterback. And so that's 1953, so we're marking the 70th anniversary of that. And my theory about that, and this is preface to your question about Justin Fields, my theory about that, and it's only somewhat facetious, is that the Bears really sort of invented the modern quarterback, and it's come back to haunt them sort of like Frankenstein's monster. When they drafted Sid Luckman in 1939, he was, as most quarterbacks were at the time, he was a single-wing tailback, played off the line of scrimmage like the shotgun, and they ran more than they passed. And the Bears were transitioning to a T formation when the quarterback gets up under center. In fact, the next year, after they drafted Luckman, they won an NFL championship 73-0, so it was working. And they won 3 other championships in the 40s after that. And I wrote down what Halas said about that. He said, we created a new type of football player, the T quarterback. Newspapers switched attention from the star runners to the quarterbacks. It marked a new era in the game. Colleges changed from the single and double wing to the T, using Luckman as their model. In Sid's 12 years with the Bears, football was completely revolutionized. The trouble was the Bears couldn't keep up with their own invention. And I've got a lot of, before I get to the Fields question here, since 1970, since the merger, which is really sort of sort of more or less defines the modern era in football, since that merger in 1970 of the AFL and the NFL, the Bears have hit only one number 1 draft choice as a quarterback, Jim McMahon. Maybe 1.5 if you include Jim Harbaugh. He was a better than average quarterback. But anyway, I've counted 11 other times they've either drafted a quarterback number 1, traded a number 1 for a quarterback, passed up an opportunity to use a number 1, or some circumstance involving a number 1 draft choice and a quarterback. But bad management and coaching and scouting and drafting and luck, somehow, some combination of that, they just haven't hit. And these examples include, I could go over all 11, we don't have enough time, but this started with a coin flip in 1970 that they lost the Pittsburgh Steelers for the right to take Terry Bradshaw. Now, losing a coin flip, that's nothing but bad luck. But this also includes in 1979, they reneged on a plan. They had every intention to draft Joe Montana in the 3rd round, and Jim Finks went into the draft, and he got cold feet because he said, we just traded a number 1 last year for Mike Phipps, so we're not going to take Joe Montana. And Bill Tobin and some of the scouts were just stunned. Other instances now, they refused to pursue Brett Favre in the early 90s like the Packers did, spent a number 1 draft choice to trade for Brett Favre. In 2005, they passed up Aaron Rodgers. They could have drafted Aaron Rodgers in 2005. Instead, they drafted Cedric Benson, a running back. He played 12 games for the Bears. So the one other thing I'll say, and it's revealing, I'm getting academic here, but it's revealing that in 10 of these 11 cases I looked up, in 10 of them, there was a different combination of decision maker, head coach, and offensive coordinator. 10 of the 11, a different combination that made the decision with the Bears. And so you can see the result of this incoherence. An example was with Fields. Fields was not drafted or coached by the guys that are drafted and coaching now. It was a previous regime. When they drafted Mitch Trubisky, the general manager didn't even tell the coach. I mean, I don't think that's the way to run a railroad myself. But you ask about Fields, and of course I'm a Fields fan because I went to Ohio State, and what the Bears wanted to do this year, the one thing they wanted to do was find out whether Justin Fields was the future. And if they had to make their decision now, it would be made. He's not the future. I'm sorry, that's what they would have to decide now. Unfortunately, they don't have to decide that now. And then you ask about Bagent. You know, what's interesting about Bagent to me is that we talked about a coin flip being bad luck. What Bagent does is remind the Bears that you don't have to spend necessarily a number one on a draft choice, on a quarterback, a number one draft choice on a quarterback. And what's baffling is the Bears have never, ever had any good luck when it comes to getting a quarterback. They've never gotten a Tom Brady in the 6th round or a Brock Purdy as the last quarterback chosen in the draft that San Francisco got last year. And I've always maintained they should draft a quarterback every year, no matter what. Somewhere in the draft they should take somebody. In the last 12 years, they've only spent one draft pick other than a number one on a quarterback in the last 12 years. And guess what his name was? David Fails. Now, you couldn't make that up. You couldn't make that up. That could only happen with the Chicago Bears.
You're exactly right. That's a good point. And Don, I've loved the answers you've given to my questions, but I know there are 100+ people here, and they have a lot of questions as well. So I'd like to open up to the audience. I'll just point to whoever.
How do you feel about the potential of the Bears vacating Soldier Field?
Well, my specialty is the past, and if I start speculating about Arlington, and I don't think my guess would be a whole lot better than yours. I think they should do it. I think they should move to Arlington. I think they should. I think the Chicago area should have a world-class domed facility that could have Final Fours and all kinds of events. You know, there's always angst about leaving the city, the actual city. But if you look at other teams, most of the teams in big cities don't play within the city limits. So I don't think that's a big deal. But I don't really know anything more about it than you probably do about the Arlington Heights or any of these other places that they go. I do think they would like to pursue it, and I think they should.
Famous fight song, every time they score a touchdown, they sing the song, you know, how you thrilled the nation with the T formation. Who was the famous musician that wrote that book?
His name was Al Hoffman, I believe. It was Hoffman. He wrote, If I Knew You Were Coming, I'd Have Baked a Cake. Same guy.
Actually,
Same guy.
Actually, as I understand it, the famous musician that wrote that song is George Hallis.
No, it was actually Al Hoffman.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Could you talk a little bit about the Kansas Comet and his running style?
Gale Sayers. I like Johnny. Remember Johnny Morris was a great running receiver for the Bears. He said for one play, the one player he would take out of all the players he'd ever seen in the NFL history would be Gale Sayers. I think Barry Sanders would be right up there too, but I think they were very similar. But yeah, Gale. If you look at, I'm glad there's YouTube now. If anybody that hasn't seen these guys, just turn it on. The guy could run sideways faster than most guys could run front way. He was terrific. But he played. You know how many games he played in the NFL? 68. 68 games.
Don, you've shared a lot of recollections of your career. Today, do you think a sports journalist could have the access that you've had during your 40-year career?
Bob, we used to be able to knock on guys' doors. People would give them. I remember Archie Mann gave me his home phone number. You know, I've had players over to my. I mean, you can't, you have to put out in a requisition practically to talk to a guy. It's just they're so protective of whatever they say, whatever they do. It's just not the same. I'm glad. Ira and I are both glad we worked when we did, right? Everybody likes to think they worked in the good old days, no matter what their profession is. We actually did, right?
The first day I covered the 49ers, when I got to San Francisco, within an hour after walking in, they handed me a list of all the players' home phone numbers.
Yeah. It used to be a rule that if you didn't get a guy, they had to give you his home phone number.
Now they won't give you a list of the players.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any Bears players that are not in the Hall of Fame that you think should be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, I hope Steve McMichael makes it. It looks like he might. Like most players and most teams, had they won more than one Super Bowl, they'd have more people that are eligible. I think Devin Hester deserves to be in. I think he'll get in. I think had they won a couple more Super Bowls, I think Jay Hilgenberg should be in. Or I don't think he'll get in, but I think had they won a couple Super Bowls, more Super Bowls, he'd have been in. The best player, a lot of people think that on that team that particular year was Wilbur Marshall. Just a terrific linebacker. So they had a lot of candidates, but I don't think they'll get anybody else in the Hall of Fame besides Hester and McMichael. I thought somebody would ask about the future of football. Get serious about it. And again, I think your guess is as good as mine. I think you could probably make the argument that the sport is too dangerous to be legal. But I think, and it might go the way of boxing and bullfighting and the gladiators, but I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime. I think we like it too much. In 2022, of the 100 most watched television programs, 82 of them NFL games. 82 out of 100. It's an astonishing. This year they've started their new 10-year television contract. The payout this year starts this year for over the next 10 years. Each team in the NFL gets $300 million a year for the next 10 years. It's an astonishing hold on our culture. And I'd be interested to know what some of you think about the future, because to me, I'm actually, I'll have to admit, I'm a little ambivalent about my own career. I followed the NFL very closely since the early 50s, since I was in grade school, because I happened to be a fan of the Cleveland Browns. And believe it or not, the Browns played in 7 of the first 8 championship games of the 50s. So I take some satisfaction in being part of the growth of the industry and writing about it, but also in glamorizing an inherently violent sport. So I'm a little ambivalent about that. And I know that, Butkus, for example, has a grandson. He's 6'9", 250 pounds. He plays volleyball. He told me his mother and his grandson saw the movie Concussion, and that was it. They would not play football. And I know that Tim Green, a former linebacker of the Atlanta Falcons, says that he thinks that football is the only sport that allows a kid to learn the valuable life lesson of being repeatedly knocked down and repeatedly getting back up, that resiliency. And I understand where he's coming from, and I recognize that football does have value, life lessons. But my kids and grandkids, all sitting right here, played soccer and hockey, and they got knocked down all the time and got back up all the time. So I'm not sure. I know there's also a very scathing book out this month. David, you might know about this, that thinks that there should be no more public funds for football. Whether schools or rec centers should not fund such a dangerous game. It ought to be private. Again, I don't think that's going to happen in our lifetime. I'd be interested to know maybe later what some of you think about the future of football. How many of you, but just quickly, how many of you ever played football, actually played football? You know, I only played for a little while in 9th grade. I was too little then. And I got hurt. I got sick. So I only played just a handful of games. I still remember those games. It was just great. It was great. It's a great, great sport, right, guys? Yeah.
All right, so we are here because of your career, because of your contributions to American culture. So I think this is a well-earned honor. I would like to thank David Sweet for a lovely, lovely job. And we have, so you have to hang up here because there are going to be photos. We have a gift for David, and then we have a award for Don that Fred is going to present. Congratulations on being this year's local legend, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Fred.